everyone, and welcome to the channel. Welcome to this exceptional video. Why is it exceptional? First, because it's being published at a completely unusual time on the channel. Also, there have been many dozens of you. Maybe I received more than 100 messages. I don't know. I didn't count. There were so many. Many of you asked me for my opinion on the film K 2019, a film in which, by the way, there are a few short excerpts from planeteraw. Before we begin, I recommend checking out the Mysteria channel, where Tony will likely share his initial thoughts on the movie K 2019. And speaking of Tony, I'll see you and we'll start right after this Thursday evening for a live session with Tony at 8 o'clock. Most likely, I'll post the information I think on the Facebook page. Don't hesitate to like the Facebook page, where I post additional information along with what I publish on the channel. Join us Thursday evening for a live discussion with Mysterian, where we'll cover various topics, particularly Egypt. So there you go. But anyway, that's for the intro. We've set the introduction. Enough with the preamble. Let's get to the heart of the matter. I watched the movie K 2019, which is over 3.5 hours long, to see what I think about it. What is announced in it? What is described? What is explained? What holds up? What is contradicted by field observations? In short, here's the movie K 2019, The Great Pyramid. What should we think about it? Let's go. So overall, the movie K 2019 offers us a new hypothesis regarding construction techniques. Not only of the Great Pyramid, but also of the granite and hardstone statues. The movie K 2019 is about geopolymers as the answer to almost all the questions about transporting and sizing the blocks. So, let's take a closer look at what it's all about. It's true that the idea, let's say it right away, the idea is quite appealing. It's very well illustrated. I think the computer graphics and 3D animations are pretty well done. And Abby embellishes this idea, as I was saying, which is appealing, which holds up, but which falls a little short. Because the key arguments of the demonstration are contradicted by the observations you can make when you go to Egypt. And these are the details we're going to look at together. The film starts by picking up again. I was quite surprised. By picking up the codes from the Revelation of the Pyramids. Revelation of the Pyramids, it uses those codes on every level. The woman's voice, how the foundations are laid, and so on. So it was quite surprising to see things handled this way. However, it's not a major issue because what we anticipate most from this film is the substance. The weighty part that the director had been promoting for weeks, even months. So that's mainly what we're going to focus on today. And even so, there's a certain flair at the beginning of the film with the vocabulary that's used in the script. With the workers who would lose it, that's the expression they use. The single file line that becomes the African file. So, there you go, there's a touch of flair that lets you overlook this kind of copy-paste from LRDP. From the beginning, there is a story about the Maidum Pyramid, and this big beam that explains quite a lot, which is well covered, which lays a good foundation and moves the debate forward. The only question we can ask is whether the cement around this beam might not come from later renovations. Because indeed, the beam is stuck in concrete, but is this concrete the same as the one used in the blocks of the pyramid? As I was saying, there have been renovations. We know that there have been renovations for thousands of years on the different temples and pyramids of Egypt. We can easily imagine original blocks separating slightly by a few centimeters or even a few dozen centimeters. And that, a little later, people tried to reconnect or join them together, with a beam around which cement or this concrete is placed to act as a binder. The Egyptians were intentional in their actions. If this beam is from the pyramid's construction, it had a specific purpose. And if it had a real architectural purpose, well, we should find other beams like this one in other pyramids. But as far as I know, that's not the case. A little later, we'll talk about what's referred to as the enclosure wall of the pyramid of Khafra. So this enclosure wall, it's not an enclosure wall, it's just a hill. It's true that there's a little challenge put forward by the WAOF asking whether it's possible to carve a hill. As for carving, yes, without any problem, with any kind of tools, even the most primitive ones. Because it's limestone, and limestone is very, very, very easy to carve and work with. This story about the hill, not to mention the fact that it's a hill and not a surrounding wall, that doesn't pose any problem in terms of carving. But when I hear that it's a surrounding wall that was poured, we need to set the record straight. That's absolutely not the case. We are on the bedrock, the mother rock of the Giza Plateau, and there are several elements that allow us to know this. First of all, we have thousands and thousands of countless tool marks directly on the limestone, which in these places should have been molded. Supposedly, the first element that allows us to know this is indeed the hill. And given the extent of the ground, if this wall had been molded, well, we would have had to mold kilometers and cubic kilometers of rock. Because, as we can also see in the images from the film, the hill stretches westward toward the desert for hundreds of meters and kilometers. There is no junction, there is no change at ground level. So, if what we see in the image is a molded wall, that means that behind it, for kilometers, for 8 to 10 meters in height, all of that is also molded. That's totally impossible. And then, there you go, those would be blocks of a completely insane size, which would still be light years away from what we can find, for example, in the Valley Temple. Speaking of the Valley Temple as well, if we start from this molding hypothesis, there's a very interesting and somewhat imprecise spot, which clearly shows us that it's granite and limestone that have been cut and fit together, and not molded. Because if it had been molded at that point, we would have had a much more precise joint. And also, for the Pyramid of Khafra, you should know that on the first 3 or 4 levels, especially on the corners, southeast, southwest, and northwest, there are huge slabs that are actually just bedrock on which the pyramid sits. A bit like the pivot of the Pyramid of Khufu. And speaking of the Pyramid of Khufu, when we talk about the grotto, about everything underground being molded, we also need to clarify things. Unfortunately, it's not molded. The pivot of the Pyramid of Khufu and what's underneath the Pyramid of Khufu is also bedrock. And to briefly return to the Pyramid of Khafra, on these blocks of bedrock, which are the hill on which the Pyramid of Khafra is built. They also use that to ensure the stability of the structure. We find many tool marks there, indicating no casting was used. With casting, once molded, you can move on to the next formwork. There's no reason, really, to come back afterwards and reshape it that much. That is, tool marks on all the visible surfaces of every block. When you go into the Red Pyramid of Dashur, I don't think he mentions it in the film, inside the Red Pyramid, in the chambers that are corbelled. Over there too, you can very clearly see the traces of the different tools that were used to cut the blocks before bringing them into the construction. So molding, right? There's another pyramid that's mentioned. It's the Pyramid of Jeffrey. That's very, very, very interesting. You'll see why. The Pyramid of Jeffrey. It is located on a piece of land, a military area that is now inaccessible, called Zawiyat El Aryan. The English call it the Unfinished Pyramid. The French call it the Great Excavation. In any case, this place was used, for example, as a filming location for the movie Land of the Pharaohs in 1954. And the director of K-2019 tells us that this immensity, this completely crazy thing, would also be cast. It's similar to Khafra's enclosure wall, which ultimately isn't a true enclosure wall. It's nothing more than the hill that was dug out. It was excavated. It was carved into the rock. And how can we know that? Well, by comparing the Egyptian remains at the bottom of this so-called unfinished pyramid. We find a kind of altar, a little oblong, very strange, with shapes on it, and not only shapes on it, but also some truly unique features. Because, as far as I know, you don't find it anywhere else in Egypt. Maybe I'm wrong, but you do find it in one place. So, except for one place, and that's in Saqqara. In Saqqara, you'll find it at the bottom of a deep well, around 12 meters down. And so, there you have it. We find this same hotel. This hotel is accessible from corridors and underground galleries on the site. And knowing that the Egyptians had continuity in their ideas and proceeded, let's say, in the same way on similar projects. To understand what we call the Pyramid of Jeffrey, the unfinished pyramid, to understand that it was indeed carved and not molded. Besides, if it had been molded, that would be absolutely crazy. Because over there, we don't have blocks. We really have a hill's height. To comprehend this, let's examine what the rock reveals about this other twin altar situated in Saqqara. As you can see, this well, like the wells in Giza for example, was indeed dug and not molded. Tool marks are everywhere. Moreover, if this well was molded, that would mean that everything else in Saqqara, which is at the same level as the one we're standing on, when you look into this well, it should have been molded as well. Which is also, obviously completely crazy, even downright impossible. Then, we have this story about the drop of water that's 1 centimeter compared to this whole drop story. Well, that's quite surprising. It's the first time I've heard about it. Okay, well, we're not necessarily going to stop there, but I think it's not that simple. It's not that simple either when it comes to counting by tens, which is then suggested with the base of 1 and then 10. The Egyptians counted based on 12, using the 12 months of the year and the 12 constellations, twice a day for 12 hours, or even once for 24 hours. For example, the baboons at the Temple of Abu Simbel, which I believe are 24 to represent the hours of the day. In short, historically, counting in Egypt was based on 12, not 10. So that surprised me too. Regarding the origin of the cubit, when we divide this circle into 6, as suggested, I would have liked to know why it was divided into 6. So maybe I forgot, but I would have liked to know why it was divided into 6 and not into 3, 5, or 4. It seems a little too random to give it a bit more credibility. Also, it's true that when we talk about the royal cubit as a royal constant, I'm surprised that we've never used this constant, but whereas up until now, we've always used pi and phi, for example. So, it's quite surprising that this universal royal constant has disappeared very quickly over the centuries, because it was no longer used in the time of Ramses II Hatshepsut and others compared to the original builders, at least, of the pyramids. It's true that, for example, phi is really the very essence of nature. Nature is governed in its visual aspect by phi. Everything that is natural is governed by phi. So in a way, it's normal to find phi in many places. However, to find it naturally. 52, 36, no. So there's an artificial aspect that means the constant isn't as universal as constants that come directly from nature, from the world itself, and from the way fauna, flora, and all organisms are structured and organized. As I was saying, there are some beautiful animations that really serve the purpose. But it's still contradicted by quite a few observations and things we see in the field. If we're casting, there's no reason for all the blocks to be different. If we're casting, we're going in one direction. Let's say, in quotes, standardize the production so that it goes as quickly as possible. So that's what I often say as well. And here, Jean-Pierre Adam shows common sense. And it's the same logic that I use when people talk to me about molded stones. If there aren't two similar ones, apart from the tool marks we've already talked about, by the way, it clearly shows that molded stone is an idea that doesn't necessarily match what we observe in the field. Then, the director asks us how the course heights of the Great Pyramid can be maintained. It's too complicated to do it by hand, so you definitely need molding and formwork to maintain the course heights. Yet, just a few moments earlier in the video, the precision at the scale of the Great Pyramid is achieved using the sunrise and ropes. So, if we can definitely achieve such a level of precision with just ropes and the sunrise at the scale of the pyramid, to me, it seems quite easy to achieve precision at the scale of small blocks. Small, of course, compared to the Great Pyramid, so if we're able to build the Great Pyramid as a whole, it's not complicated to make blocks that will all have the same height. An intriguing point is the comparison between the Tura limestone and the limestone found on the Great Pyramid. So the chemical composition was analyzed and they found that there are differences, so I found that very interesting. I'm not knowledgeable enough in chemistry to comment on that, but in any case, it's one of the points we can't say much about. Because here, it's analytical and it's very relevant in the context of the director's demonstration. Next, they're going to talk to us about geopolymers, not just on soft rocks, like limestone, but also on hard rocks. With granite, with this kind of structure, with an incredible super lens that will melt the granite, then transport it in small pieces, melt it again, and re-agglomerate it, etc. There are 4 elements we can rely on to understand that this is, as I said, always an appealing idea. So why not? But it doesn't work. Why? 4 elements. The first element is to ask how the lens was positioned to cut under this part of the Aswan quarry. Because if the lens is above the rock substrate, as suggested by the author and the director, I don't know how we could cut below the level of the rock. Especially since when you're on site at the Aswan obelisk, you can see very clearly the movement of the tools, the movement that was made to work the rock. It is continuous from the opposite wall all the way under the rock. The second element is the shafts at the Aswan quarry. Eventually, why not? If we ignore a lot of other things, why not? The lens allows you to extract these small pieces, 30 centimeters by 30. Okay, why not? But then what about the wells? How are these wells dug with the lens? That we don't say. And when we look inside the wells, how are they shaped? There are no longer those little marks that would be, how should I say, typical of this melting caused by the lens. So that's the second element that will contradict this idea. The third element is the excerpt, by the way, that's used from one of my videos about the joints. And if there are no joints around the Assoyne obelisk, we're definitely talking about the obelisk. Because elsewhere in the quarry there are joints, so it's really just at that spot. If there are no joints, it's precisely thanks to the shafts that allowed them to check the quality of the rock in depth. And if they worked at that spot, it's because they knew there were no joints, no flaws in the rock. They could go there with complete confidence. The fourth element that contradicts this story about lenses in the granite is that if the granite had melted, it would have been homogeneous. Yet, on the facing of the Pyramid of Mykerinos, for example, you can very clearly see stratification defects in the granite, which shows that we are dealing with natural rock that has not been melted and cooled. It was cut, transported, how? That raises other questions, but it was cut, transported, and placed just like that from the natural granite of Aswan. And then, maybe also a little fifth element, I'll show you a photo of a statue that's in the Luxor Museum, so that not many people go to see. Well, when you see the statue of Amenephis III, well, I don't know if you can see it very well in the picture. I hope you can see it, my friends. But the corners of the lips are carved with utmost delicacy and finesse. It's absolutely splendid. They are not molded, they are carved. And when you get very close to them in person, you can see that they are carved and not molded. And what about the small holes above the Aswan obelisk with the lens that would pierce through? Those are simply traces of reuse. It's simply salvage work with unsuitable tools, salvage work that was then abandoned along the way. That's what remains of this salvage work. Who abandoned it? Still regarding the obelisks, a little later in the film, we'll be told about the obelisk of Karnak, the obelisk of Hatshepsut, which will also be taken up a little later by her son, Thutmose III, and we're told that the obelisk is perfectly smooth with absolutely amazing hieroglyphs, which is true, at least for the hieroglyphs. However, for the obelisk itself, that's less the case. So the one of Hatshepsut, when you look at it almost vertically from its base, if the light isn't too bright in the middle of the day, well, you can clearly see that its surface is wavy, a little bit like an Aswan, and so you can clearly see that the work was done in Aswan, before bringing the block as it is, in one piece, to Karnak. That clearly doesn't solve the tools and transportation issue mentioned earlier. But still, this example of the obelisk at Karnak, unfortunately, is invalidated by simple visual observations. What do we see on site when we go there? Then people talk to us about the copper notches in the Grand Gallery of the Pyramid of Khufu, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's quite surprising because I think it's pretty well known and recognized as simply being either supports or markers. In any case, it's not at all contemporary with the construction of the pyramid, but it's actually modern. Well, modern anyway. It's less than 200 years old. Next, there's a very interesting story, the story of the cracks on the ceiling of the king's chamber. Why is it interesting? Because it leads to the story of the passage, which goes up from the Grand Gallery all the way into the relieving chambers. So, it was an opening that was made at the same time as the construction of the Great Pyramid. And so, the story of Khufu's cartouche, found in Campbell's chamber by Howard Weiss at the beginning of the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, that kind of falls apart, because it doesn't prove at all that it was made by the builders. And it could very well have been added by the Egyptians or by more recent peoples when this pyramid was reused, by sneaking through this passage that leads to the chamber. However, the author very rightly points out, a little later, what is above the king's chamber. They are not necessarily relieving chambers, because given the location of the king's chamber, if they were relieving chambers, everything suggests that we should also have them above the subterranean chamber, and above the middle chamber. The queen's chamber, while there is nothing above the subterranean chamber, and for the queen's chamber, the middle chamber. We have some rafters that look a bit like what we have above the original entrance of the Great Pyramid, but we don't have any relieving chambers at all, so that's a very good point. It's very interesting that this is being brought up once again. Next, there's also talk about the Sphinx being cast. Now, I don't know where this nonsense comes from, because we know that the Sphinx was carved. The Sphinx is a monolith, it was carved out of the rock, and everything that was extracted around the Sphinx and, in quotes, almost on the Sphinx itself. During his work, he is in front of it in a temple that is not open to the public. These enormous blocks can also be found elsewhere. But in any case, all the so-called waste from carving the Sphinx was reused. There's no reason to imagine a molded Sphinx. I'm unsure where that idea comes from. It's quite surprising. And as for the paving stones, as he says, that decorate, well, those aren't decorative paving stones and they're not contemporary. Post-molding at the time. They're simply small bricks that are part of renovations. Renovations that have been ongoing for millennia, ever since the time of Moses and the dream stele. After it was cleared of sand, I believe there were already some minor restorations. So there you have it, it's not contemporary at all. It's very strange, all these new ideas about the Sphinxes. But actually, the good point here as well is that when you look at the Sphinx in profile, it's Prognathaus. It's not what we call Proto-European. And the first time this was mentioned was in the New York Times on July 18th, 1992, by a person named Frank Domingo, who is a physiognomist and criminologist with the New York police, who engaged in the comparison of profiles, which I often talk about with my groups when I go to Egypt. He analyzed them using orthodontic photographic techniques. And the head of the Sphinx shows maxillary prognathism. In contrast, the statue of Khafra at the Cairo Museum, also believed to depict him, does not feature this pronounced chin. The statue of Khafra at the Cairo Museum, on the other hand, is actually quite Proto-European. And you can also see it on the 10-pound bills, because it's the depiction of this statue of Khafra that is also present on the 10-pound bills in Egypt. So, a good point, it was nice to see that. However, I must confess that I also have some issues with the extrapolations and interpretations made subsequently. It's true that I struggle with everything related to Afrocentrism. That some pharaohs were black, there's no problem with that, or that some pharaohs were white or mixed race. With so many millennia of history, it's completely normal for cultures. Egypt, at the crossroads of Africa, Europe, and Asia, has a mixed population. And Africa, not only North African Maghreb, but also Sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa. When you go to Aswan, you see that you are already facing a black people. So it's not crazy to think that some pharaohs could have been black, but to go as far as to draw such a firm and assertive conclusion, saying that all the pharaohs were black. So I want to ask, what about all those statues that don't have any Negroid features? There you go, you just have to look at the representations, the faces, you just have to look at the statues. For example, there's the statue of Ramses II, which is in the Turin Museum, and it doesn't have any Negroid features at all. That also refers to the previously mentioned statue of Khafra from the Cairo Museum. And there you go, there are thousands and thousands of statues everywhere that don't have any Sub-Saharan African morphological features. So, here as well, the findings invalidate that idea. And it's true that when you look a little more closely at Antediop's work, there are some shortcomings. In summary, there were both black and non-black pharaohs in ancient Egypt. Let's conclude this discussion here. That's enough to understand and fully appreciate the diversity that existed throughout all these pharaonic eras. It's surprising to see this story about hieroglyphs in Australia. I've never talked about it on the channel, simply because they're proven fakes from the early 20th century. Actually, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were Australian soldiers who came back from missions in Egypt during the First World War, and one of those soldiers in particular. For example, he openly admitted to having made representations of the Sphinx and pyramids, and that his unfortunate companions also at the time engaged in hieroglyph writing. A little bit approximate? It has been proven, so they're fakes. I don't know why it's considered a truth, even though, in quotes, there is. I don't remember his last name anymore, Muhammad Ibrahim and Youssef Aouyan, who say that yes, it's completely authentic. So, I disagree with that, we know that it's not. It has been proven several times and the information is available on the internet in just 2 or 3 clicks. Then we go to the other side of the world to develop things a little further. Notably in Elora and Barabar near the city of Gaia. Indeed, it shows that all of this would have been molded as well. All of this will need to be checked on site, and interestingly, we'll be able to check it together. Early 2021 when we go to India, so that's a little scoop for you on the channel. I don't have all the details of the itinerary yet, which I've been working on for several months, but there you go, we're gonna go. And then, I think without being too wrong that it's not molded, there's another tooling issue, as always, but it's not molded. And we'll go check that in just under a year, so it'll go by quickly, I think. For those who want information about the little trip to India that we're organizing, you know the channel's email, planeteraw.com. I'll reply to you when the information is available. And well, that's where this little debrief ends. So it's not debunking, because quite simply, there are also interesting elements, as I mentioned in the video, that we need to keep. But, generally speaking, the main idea regarding casting is unfortunately contradicted by too many on-site observations for us to give it that much credibility. It could have been on a smaller scale, occasionally a temporary solution, but that's absolutely not the way the Egyptians built these magnificent structures.